What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on Football. I'm Joe Patrick, Falcons insider for 92.9 The Game, and we continue with a rainy week of training camp so far this week as the Falcons continue to gear up for their first preseason action of the season against the Lions here at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta on Friday night. So that'll be exciting, maybe, hopefully. I don't know. Maybe today. Today is probably when you're listening to this, which will be on Wednesday, is the most exciting day of training camp this week. This is when the Falcons are doing kind of a scrimmage. Raheem Morris really likes to get these guys in the mode of a game. And for him, this is when the starters are basically going to be getting their scrimmage time, their practice time. He does it because they can mitigate injuries in a scrimmage session as opposed to a full preseason game. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But ultimately, for the preseason game, wouldn't expect. Obviously, we know the quarterbacks weren't going to start, but I wouldn't expect many of the other skill position guys, the guys that we're really looking forward to seeing this season. Obviously, star for the Falcons and hopefully play very well. Won't see many of them on the field Friday night, in my opinion. And we'll get into more of that. I'm going to do something a little different today. Going to take some of your questions, mainly because when we were at practice today, they had moved the session indoors, which unfortunately for any Falcons fans who are coming up hoping to see the team practice, that was closed basically because you obviously can't have fans inside. But the sight lines, for as bad as they are sometimes, even when we're out there on the field with players kind of lined up between us and where the scrimmage action is taking place, pretty much always going to be the case when they're practicing inside, with the amount of players that they have currently on the roster that are participating and the amount of media that are kind of clustered into a small area, obviously, because they need all the space possible when they're just on like one indoor field. So understandable, but didn't really get to see a whole lot and be able to describe a whole lot of what was going on. It did look like the defense was making some more plays. There were a couple of interceptions, I believe, and one near interception. Mike Ford kind of took a deflected pass that was from Penix that got tipped at some point along its route, and Mike Ford almost grabbed it in time, but Josh Kendall, I'm trusting his eyes from the Athletic. He said it hit the turf, so no turnover there. I believe Josh Thompson, a safety, had an interception for the Falcons, as well as DeMarco Hellams. Those were two that I saw happen today. So good to see the defense getting active, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to your questions. Before we do that, did want to get to a little bit of news that's come out this afternoon. First of all, Jordan Addison is going to miss the game against the Falcons in week 2 when Atlanta travels to Minnesota to play there. I believe that's on a Sunday night. Addison was awaiting word on a suspension that he was going to receive from the NFL for a speeding violation, I believe it was. And he's going to miss. I can't even remember. I think was it 3 games? It may have been 3 games, but he's definitely going to miss the week 2 game against the Falcons. So that's great news for them. You only have Justin Jefferson to have to track down around the field. Hopefully AJ Terrell can do the business in that one, but we'll see. Similarly, and less certain of this one, but Chris Godwin, I saw kind of break across Twitter today that he's got an ankle injury and he's kind of in question for week 1. I'm not going to call him like officially questionable like you would with an injury designation. And I'm obviously not like in camp. I just kind of saw this come across Twitter. So it sounds like he's in question. You could probably say if Tampa fans were looking at what's happening with the Falcons right now, they might be saying something similar about Darnell Mooney, considering he's out. And it is, frankly, a question mark as to whether he's going to be able to play in that week 1 game. But certainly a hit for, that Buccaneers offense. With Godwin, obviously being a key receiver for them, and they're already going to be missing Tristan Wirfs in that game as well as he deals with an injury recovering this training camp. So some good news on the injury front for the Falcons opponents, and not that we wish ill against people especially for injury. But Jordan Addison, he's got to learn his lesson. He's got to go in timeout at least for the Falcons game. So that's a good one. And that's it for the news. Before we get into the questions, I did kind of want to highlight one thing that happened today, not in the practice, but just like, sometimes like guys say things when we're talking in the interviews afterwards that I kind of pique my interest or my curiosity, and I think that are worth sharing. And there was just one little comment from Brandon Dorless when he's talking about the scheme. Brandon Dorless, a player, obviously a lot of people are excited to see, and we'll again talk about that a little bit later. But he talked about the defensive line being vertical, which I thought was an interesting way to phrase. Like, that's the way they want to play. And it certainly fits with what we know about what this Falcons attack style front wants to be, which is kind of gap penetrators and just creating havoc in the backfield and not really reading and reacting. And I asked him if he's kind of not familiar, like unfamiliar with an attack style offense, but if he's ever kind of gone this full bore into it. And he basically said no, that at Oregon, there obviously was, concepts of this kind of attack style defense, but they mix it up. There was also some gap reading stuff that had to happen. And I think he sounds really, really excited. The phrase going around regarding this kind of attack style front and kind of getting vertical, shooting these gaps, from Nate Ollie, the defensive line coach, is, quote, "If you think, you stink." So it's like there's no thought, just like like he said, like Nate Ollie says, you run it. We want our guys to run into dark rooms. We want them to just get in the backfield and see what's back there and see if they can make a play and just kind of let their instincts take over. And I think it's going to put quite an onus on the linebacker group, even though they're more attack style too. And even the safeties kind of filters back in terms of the gaps that they've got to kind of make up for when you've got guys who are shooting and just creating more chaotic pictures for them in their minds as they're kind of approaching that line of scrimmage. Should be interesting to see how this Falcons defense settles with all of that. Dorless also kind of spoke about his love for Jeff Olrich, and this is kind of becoming a theme with a lot of players. Like, they just love the guy. They love the passion that he brings. You see it in some of like the mic'd up stuff that the Falcons have been putting out. You can see Brick. He gets emotional with these guys, passionate with these guys, intense with these guys, and that's what I think they really like. He's kind of. I think the players feel like he's kind of like in the trenches with them in terms of like what you have to bring energy wise to be a successful football player. And he kind of brings that as a coach and, being a former player. And, some guys refer to it's the linebacker that's still inside of him that is kind of part of him and part of his coaching style. And I think all the guys really appreciate that kind of thing. And Dorless said that he actually, he came to love Jeff Olrich. Not even with the Falcons. It was actually when Dorless was at the Senior Bowl in his, going into the draft process when Olrich would have been with the Jets at that time. So tells you it's a little even more genuine. He's not just sucking up to his coach. It really does seem to be. And you can see like when they talk about not just Dorless, but it did happen with him. But all these guys, it seems like when they talk about Olrich, their faces really kind of light up. And there's like a big kind of smile that they have when they're talking about him. And that did not happen last year with Jimmy Lake. I think they were more measured with their comments. So I think everybody on this defense is really excited about what they can potentially do. And just generally, I think really accepting the challenge that Olrich is laying out for them in terms of what they have to execute in order to be successful. So that's it. There's some other good stuff, by the way. I would recommend. I always recommend like going to Atlanta Falcons YouTube to check out the interviews that they do. Bijan Robinson and Ryan Newsel also spoke today, amongst some other guys. So that stuff is worth checking out. I actually did post on my Twitter. I clipped the part where Bijan Robinson is doing his Zach Robinson impersonation, which I found quite funny. Yeah, especially if you were like familiar with the way that Zach Robinson talks and kind of his mild mannerisms. But I don't want to give it away any more than that. I'm certainly not going to do the impression myself. So with that out of the way, just going to answer some questions, which is going to allow us to talk a little bit about some different aspects of the team. And thank you guys for all submitting them. It was kind of last minute, but I just thought it would be a fun thing to do this afternoon. So let's get into it. And I'm just going to run down from the top here. I did have to take a cursory glance over all these, and they are generally pretty good questions. May not be able to answer all of them to your satisfaction. But let's get started with Adizi Dad on. That's the best I can pronounce that. It says, how do Penix and Kirk compare? Can they both start? Yes, they're both, in my opinion, like when you just watch them play, they're both obviously starting quarterback talents in this league. And, you hear that too from like the first team defense is going up against Kirk Cousins. And they're talking about how it's like great prep for them because Kirk can make all the right checks at the line of scrimmage and really kind of challenge them in that respect tactically. But also he's threading those throws in. And I say threading because the ball, obviously, I think we all understand, just looks more impressive when it's coming out of Michael Penix's hand. Like There's just the revolutions on it, the velocity, he's like throwing these ropes around, which are really, really impressive. Kirk's comes out with like a little bit more of a lob. We're typically getting a look from like a side profile of the throw. And so like Kirk's balls typically, especially obviously if he's throwing downfield, there's a little bit of an arc to that ball where there might not be with Penix. But, I think a lot of receivers would kind of want that. I think that, that's kind of a challenge for potentially for Michael Penix to be able to kind of put some touch on some of these kinds of throws. Obviously, Penix's arm strength and talent is going to allow him to really kind of stick some in there deeper down the field. But it's more of the underneath stuff where I think Kirk throws probably a more catchable ball at this point, frankly. And, Bijan Robinson even talked about this. I remember him talking about it last year when it was like his first experience catching passes from Kirk when training camp started, because obviously Kirk hadn't been able to play much in OTAs and that kind of thing. And he's just talking about how Kirk just like puts it right in the exact spot you want it, where you don't even have to think about really catching it that much. You can already start planning what you're going to do with the ball. Maybe that's just Bijan being special, but to get back to the question, both these guys are really good. And, that's why the Falcons weren't just going to give Kirk away and get nothing back for him. He still serves a role, whether that's as an insurance backstop potentially, or if they can get something they feel like is worth the value that they put on him, then I'm sure that they would do that. And we'll see if that, comes to pass. But as things stand right now, they're both ready to start. But, I said this in a video, I think maybe it was last week when Kirk was maybe having a better day or two than Michael Penix. I mean, there's no question. Obviously, Michael Penix is the starter. That's never going to be in question this season. I know, like some people are saying, like, well, what if Penix starts, 1-3? He's still going to be the quarterback. Like they're not going to change the quarterback because the results are bad. And even if it's kind of because Penix is throwing some interceptions, which I do think that is probably on the cards for Michael Penix. I think that we've talked a little bit about my annoyances with the inaccuracy, the pundits kind of putting this inaccuracy label on him. I'm not trying to say that he is like a perfectly accurate passer. Zach Robinson has voiced that he disagrees with the inaccuracy comments that are attached to Penix. But my take is just, I think that the positive plays, the positive high impact plays that he's going to make, the high value throws that he's going to be able to provide are just ultimately going to outweigh some of the bad misses that he's going to tend to have, or some of the interceptions that he might throw. But having said that, he hasn't thrown many interceptions so far in this training camp. So I don't even think that the interceptions are necessarily going to be an issue with him. Maybe more so the annoyances with fans could potentially be some of these just misses on balls that should be completed that might force you to punt or something like that. But both are looking good. And that's pretty much it. Let's get to the next question. CA asks, which defensive additions that were underutilized or weren't on the team last year are you most excited to see this year? You could go, man, it's tough because there's so many choices. And maybe before training camp, I would have said a player like Zach Harrison, who I felt is been underutilized for basically since he came, because when you're around Zach in person, he's just so damn impressive physically. Like, he's a giant and he's got these long arms. And you can see the power profile that he puts on tape. He really can overpower some guys. And I love that about him. Also love that he's a Buckeye. But maybe that's not the only reason. Having said that, how can you not be most excited to see James Pierce Jr. at this point? It's like we've seen the fights. We've heard about all the success that he's had in training camp. And I'm lucky enough to have seen some of the success that he's had in training camp and his pass rushes. How can you? I know it's probably the obvious choice, but how can you not say him? I want to see how he fares against some of these offensive tackles. And it's just like, the Falcons fan that's still inside of me just can't wait to see this team potentially, actually get a fair amount of sacks this year with some of these guys that they've brought in. But like I said, there's so many choices. You could go with Ruka Roro is a great option. We talked about Brandon Dorless. He's a guy who a lot of people are interested in. A lot of second-year players, obviously, along that front that were, to CA's point, underutilized last year. But then you obviously have these edge rushers. A lot of people would say Jalen Walker, especially if you're a Georgia fan. You want to see how he does. So, yeah, lots to choose from there. But I got to go with James Pierce Jr. at this point. Rohan asks, would be cool to see analysis on preseason and how that affects regular season play and injury, both across the NFL and during the Matt Ryan years. And how do you think joint practices will go? And what we saw from the Dolphins practice, I remember last year the Falcons did well. Yeah, haven't been able to see. I definitely not last year because I just don't travel. I only travel. The only road game I'll go on this year is Charlotte because I have family members that live there and it's easily drivable, so it's easy to do for me. But otherwise, I don't travel, and so they did the joint practices on the road last year. I guess 2 years ago I did see them. I believe they were at home against the Jaguars, although that could have been 2 years ago or 3 years ago. I'm not sure. Anyway, I saw them play the Jaguars once in joint practices. And then next week, they'll obviously be against the Titans. And again, that's going to be the scrimmage, the full speed, scrimmaging practice, preseason snaps, whatever you want to call them for the starters. Again, because they can mitigate the injuries. And when I say mitigate injury, it's really about the quarterback. It's really just about not hitting the quarterback. That's what it's about. So for that reason, I'm obviously really looking forward to them. The other reason though, and again, we've talked about it on preseason, like don't expect to see the starters play this Friday or the next Friday because you have the joint practices. And we just know, like Raheem Morris has said, the philosophy has not changed, which means the philosophy has not changed from last year. So I would expect to see basically what we saw last year. I think the other important point to make that and maybe it's because of the way that the NFL has changed with regards to the cuts happening just all at the very end, and you don't kind of have to do these different cut deadlines throughout training camp. Wouldn't that, to me, that maybe contributes to the way that a lot of teams are handling preseason. Clearly, the way Raheem Morris handles the distribution of snaps in training camp, which is the starters and like the ones and twos are getting like almost all of the work in practice, and it's the developmental guys. Raheem Morris, puts in a developmental period. It's usually the last team period of practice. They'll do all of practice. They'll do all their teamwork. They'll do special teams. And then there will be one final team portion of practice. And that's the developmental portion. But that's not a lot of snaps. And so what these preseason games are really good for is for these guys who are developmental players, guys who are, hopeful, just trying to make the practice squad. It's an opportunity for them to go out for a full game and just get a lot of reps. And especially for guys in the trenches and things like that, you need those opportunities to put your game on tape. And that's essentially where the team is going to be evaluating some of these guys. And again, in terms of the guys of who they're going to want to add to the practice squad, the guys they're going to want to keep around. It's just a better opportunity to see them play at full speed. And frankly, you don't have to be so worried about one of them getting injured. It sounds like we're just like discounting them as like a lesser class football player, but kind of the honest truth is that they kind of are, at least in their level of talent. So I just think that that's maybe something that goes kind of under thought about when we talk about who's going to play in some of these preseason games. On the Go Sports asks, will there be another starter level move for a wide receiver or defensive player? Yeah, last year we saw obviously the team kind of go into the free agent market and the trade market to acquire Matthew Judon and Justin Simmons. I wouldn't expect it. I don't really see, obviously On the Go Sports points out the receiver, and yeah, with Mooney out, you do feel like you're a little bit short there, but I don't see themselves like kind of overextending in that respect. Don't really know even like what the market looks like for a player. I don't think that they're really looking to add to the roster at this point, unless they really feel like, obviously, unless a player goes down, they feel like they need to replace that player, like we saw last year. Obviously with Braylon Trice and with DeMarco Hellams going out for the year in those preseason games, and then they replace them basically with veterans. And while we were all excited about the Matthew Judon move, and I certainly was one of them, that move ultimately didn't work out, and the Falcons, probably could have felt like they could have used that third round pick. So. And this team is already traded away. I think they're already short 2 picks from the moves that they made in the last draft for next year's draft. So in terms of like trade capital, even Not a whole lot there for them, so I wouldn't expect them to go for any. Obviously, I think there was some money that got freed up with McGarry signing his extension. I'm not a cap guy. I think we've got another question about this. I really, it's one thing I struggle with, and I don't kind of keep up on probably as much as I should. Having said that, I think that any extra cap room the team ultimately has, and opens up, even if it were to happen with Kirk, for example, if a trade were to manifest there, I think the way the team would use empty cap space is try to use it as room to sign like Drake London, for example, to his next contract and be able to front load maybe some monies somewhere, just move the coinage around to just make the cap situation as healthy as possible for you going forward. Samir A says everyone's got differing opinions, so I wanted to hear your thoughts on whether or not the starters should get some preseason reps and impact it may or may not have on how the team comes out week one. Yeah, so I guess this is like a little bit different twist on the preseason question, which is like just like my personal opinion. I do like I'm not gonna say I think it's totally worthless. Like I think it probably helps in some respect to have the guys out there for a few series for the at very least, just to allow them to kind of feel the the surroundings of Mercedes-Benz Stadium, just to kind of know what that's going to feel like. But having said that, I don't put a whole lot into it. I do want to see them. I would say this: I do want to see them for a very selfish reason and like impatient reason, which is that like who wouldn't want to see Michael Penix go out and play? Like of course I want to see the best players play. I want to be entertained, like Nirvana. But ultimately, coaches have their own priorities, and they're right to. The other thing I would say about this, and a lot of people will point to the Falcons, the way they started last year against the Steelers, as being like very much evident that they needed to have that preseason action. I do wonder, like, it's kind of a no-win situation, but like the person who really could have used some preseason action was Zach Robinson calling a game. He hadn't called an NFL game, regular season game before, but you can't call what like your offense in a preseason game. Like that's all obviously a strategic mistake as well. So for as much as you would have wanted that to happen, you understand that it can't. And that ultimately, I think, is what hurt the Falcons in that game more than like individual players being rusty. There was like some things, like there was a fumble that happened that was featured in that quarterback's documentary because they were kind of scrambling to get things the snap off before a delay of game. But again, I would kind of put that down on Zach Robinson, and even Kirk was like talking about it in quarterback, saying talking about how like play call kind of comes in late. There's a lot of motion that's happening, and maybe Zach's got to be smarter in that situation when they are pressed up against the clock like that. And by the way, I remember like Zach after that game, he kind of came out, I think the next week, and basically like apologized. Like, yeah, that was my bad, guys. And that was wild. That was you wouldn't see the tendencies in a high school game that happened from the Falcons in that game. So hopefully they've learned their lessons and Zach Robinson's more comfortable there. And by the way, and Bijan did say that like he's noticed Zach Robinson being like a lot more comfortable just in his role going into the second year as the offensive coordinator. So that's good as well. And another reason you should watch those press scrums on the Falcons YouTube channel. Mike D. Luffy Jr., aka Last Night Gus, asks, I know he's got some reps with the first team lately, but how has Casey Washington looked all camp? Does he look like he could be a solid wide receiver 4? So it's interesting because the initial 53-man roster projection that I put out on the podcast early last week, I left Casey Washington off the team. I can't even remember if I had him like as one of the practice squad slots. If I didn't, I probably should have. And I kind of thought at that point that the signing of DJ Chark was a bad sign for him. Maybe it was at the time, but having said that, he's really kind of come back and made himself a lot more noticeable. I guess that's the way I would describe his play on the field. Like you notice when he's out there, he is catching some more balls, and he is starting to rep with the ones a little bit. He is extremely athletic. I think one of the reasons why you notice when he's out there is because he does have like a burst of speed and a bit of twitchiness to him, just athletically, that other guys don't have, like a David Sills, for example. Like David Sills is very much like a more of the methodical, crafty route runner type, where Casey Washington, I think, is kind of the opposite. In fact, I think he's a little bit sloppy with his route running. I know this was highlighted by one of those quarterback analysts. I can't remember if it was the QB school or if it was one of the guys at the Athletic, but somebody was breaking down some of the preseason action from Penix last year when he was thrown to Washington, and they kind of noted that there was maybe some sloppy routes by Washington. And I feel like what that ends up forcing is like you'll see Casey Washington like laying out and diving for a lot of balls, and that could just be general inaccuracy, typically from Penix, because that's when he's tended to get those passes from. But I do wonder if some of that is also down to maybe some of the route running as well. But I should go back. He is looking more like he's going to make the roster at this point. I would say like if cut day was happening right now, I think he probably does make the roster. So, but he's certainly fighting for it, and some other guys are as well. And Chark hasn't really kind of gotten action, so he's definitely kind of right now he's looking to me like one's like, okay, you work him out, you sign him, you see what he's got. Sometimes he just doesn't have it. Anyway, Greg asks, how's the Rooks and UDFAs looking thus far? Yeah, I mean, like, I think they're all looking good. I think the UDFAs probably haven't made the impression that a lot of people, myself included, maybe thought or hoped they would, because, Terry Fontenot said that, they wanted to make a concerted effort to go out and to like spend some money on these guys and like give them some contracts to recruit them basically to Atlanta, considering that Atlanta didn't have as many picks in that draft. And, guys like Nick Nash, I'm trying to think, Joshua Gray, the offensive lineman, like those are kinds of guys that you were hopeful about. And I wouldn't say that they've really stood out in any sort of way, at least to me. Kobe Bryant has gotten into the fold, had an interception in Monday's practice, which is good to see. I would note that like he wasn't like in coverage against anyone for the interception. I think it was like an overthrow. I actually didn't have a great look at it from my vantage point, but he was basically one where he was like kind of in a zone or covering somebody else. Like the ball wasn't really kind of intended to go towards him, but it did, and he just caught the ball basically. But an interception is an interception. He actually, the nicer play that he had earlier in practice was a PBU. And I would say that that's looking good for him, considering that he's basically he's come off the NFI list and been introduced into team drills. He is getting rotations in with some of the like second team and reserve guys, and that's better than some of the other UDFAs. And the rookies, they're obviously going to get a lot of run. They're going to get a lot of play, and I think they're all looking pretty good. Billy Bowman was, I noted in a tweet today, he was the first nickelback. I always think about the band unfortunately, whenever I say that. He was the first nickel to play with the first team defense when team session started today. I then noted that, and then like after I noted that, then D. Alford was in, then Mike Ford was in. So then I think ultimately what they were just doing today was just running through a lot of different, trying to get looks at different guys. But Xavier Watts, I think he was not with the starters today. I didn't actually notice him where he was playing today. He obviously had like a little injury thing. He didn't talk to media today. They've been planning to try to get us to talk to him for a while, and for like injury reasons, when they don't practice fully, they don't want to speak to media, and so that has basically not been happening for the last 5 days or so, and a couple off days included in there. So, but generally, I think everybody's looking good. Kind of on this note, Falcons formula asks, how has D. Alford looked recently? Do you think his snaps could decrease as the season goes on, allowing Billy Bowman Jr. to adjust to the NFL? Or is there a third option at nickel? Yeah, I mean, I think like the nickel options right now are those three that I just went through. I can't remember if there's any others that were getting rotated in today. Those would, I think, be the three to really identify. And really, it's kind of more like two. Like I wouldn't really seriously consider Mike Ford as a nickel. Probably more like in a dime situation when you're getting more defensive backs out on the field would be the time for him. And obviously, special teams player. And I think I left him off my 53-man projection too. Probably put him on that 53. We'd probably have to figure out who to drop off of there in that cornerback room. But I think that Mike Ford just will make the team because he is an important special teams player. And that's how you make 53-man rosters. Sometimes more talented players, but if you're not starting on special teams, that's kind of maybe more practice squad situation for you. So having said that, D. Alford look good. I mean, I think he looks like, I want to say like, oh, he's like a different player in this scheme, but I really think that the scheme better suits him. Like I think that he's just going to get more opportunities to have simpler roles basically on the field, like just like kind of man coverage or whatever it is, and have some more success than what he was asked to do last year. It sounded like last year he was kind of felt hard done by the scheme and kind of how it was leaving him a little bit vulnerable at times. But I do think that like this is probably a situation where the Alford is going to be the starting nickel going into week one. But then, yeah, wouldn't be surprised if at some point, we're going to see Billy Bowman. It could be through an injury. Hope not, but it could be, or just some of the times, those natural progressions with the starting units over the course of the season, especially on defense, tend to happen. Mike Drop asked, does it look like we can stop the run? I mean, I don't want to like make a proclamation about like whether they're going to be good or whether they're going to be bad at this point at stopping the run. I will say though, I think like I'll just kind of put out a warning with regards to like all the fun things that we imagine in our heads when we hear Brandon Dorless talking about, getting vertical, shooting gaps, getting in the backfield. If you think you stink, all that stuff. I am a little bit concerned about how that's going to manifest with regards to the run defense. I think that it's very possible that the coaching staff has basically decided, okay, if we do want to be vulnerable in some respect defensively, maybe it is in the run game, and we're willing to live with that as long as we can get to the quarterback, and kind of the way that we're going to play is going to generate more tackles behind the line of scrimmage, force teams in the passing downs. We can get after the quarterback, do that kind of thing. I wouldn't be surprised if they give up some chunk runs this year. So we'll see. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to ultimately look. Obviously, they're getting a great test going against this offensive line against a back in Bijan Robinson. Wouldn't be the ones really going against them, but I have to think they're getting a good look in practice. And last one from Frustrated Falcons fan, aren't we all? Heard people speak of the money benefit to the Falcons choosing Craig over Koo. Are there any other players positions where it would benefit the Falcons salary cap to choose cheaper options? Yeah, again, the only one that comes to mind at another position would be like if they were to cut David Onyemata basically and just free up that money. David Onyemata, I think, is on like 17 million or something this year. So, I mean, that would clear a lot of money. Having said that, like they don't really have a need to clear money. The team is basically set, like we were talking about earlier, and they already have now, I believe, enough of an operating budget essentially to go forward this season where they don't really need to make any more money available, whether that is through an Onyemata, which I would, at this point, that seems like an extreme option to take. And David Onyemata is a locked-in starter for this team, and they kind of need him, honestly, on that defensive front. Again, we talk about stopping the run. So that I don't think is on the cards at all anymore. And then, with regards to Koo and Craig, I think it's just, I think Lenny Craig, I think the Falcons understand that he needs a year of going through. It's even I think it's some of the finer things, like what it's like to fly to a place and, what Koo goes through on a game day. You gotta understand, he didn't start kicking until after COVID. That's when he's started to pivot towards kicking a football versus a soccer ball. So, and just kind of put stuff on clips on social media and stuff. So he's just very, very new to this. Very, very talented, as we've talked about, has a huge leg. But I think Koo's going to win this job. I mean, Koo is looking really good, and he looks like he's back to his old self. And I would say I noted this on the show yesterday, but it's not just the fact that Koo is making the kicks that he's being tasked with going out and making in practice, but they look good. Like the kicks look good. They're traveling end over end. They're not knuckling or doing anything crazy, and the kicks are generally traveling down the middle of the goalpost, which is great. So I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's not a job that Craig can win. It's only a job that Koo can lose, basically. And if the Falcons did want to cut Koo, I believe that they would save a net of $3 million. So yeah, he's making $5.5 million this year. Koo is, and then he would, if they were to cut him, it would have a dead cap of $2.5 million. Next year, it gets a little bit better for them. He will be earning nearly $6 million next year, 5 3/4, $5,750,000, and the dead cap at that point is only $1,250,000. So the dead cap cuts in half, obviously, at that point, with 1 year less on the 2 years left on his deal. So there's that. So with that out of the way, looking forward to an exciting practice on Wednesday, and then we will probably come back to you guys with another podcast after the preseason game sometime potentially late Friday night or over the weekend. Stay tuned. But again, thank you everybody for engaging with the show in any way you have. You can also follow me. I never really promote this. I probably should. No, on X if I do want to like ask for more questions from you guys. But I'm at JAPatrick200 on X and Instagram. So you can follow me there. I don't really post anything on Instagram. It's more of a personal thing. But if you want to follow me there, you can. And definitely follow the station 929 The Game's YouTube channel. That's where you can watch this show if you're listening to us on podcast form. And if you're watching, you can listen to us on podcast. Just search Joe Patrick on football, wherever you get your podcast. So with that out of the way, we'll talk to you guys later.